In this review we're going back in time to 1993, and that's because this model is of a crane that was built in 1993. It is the Liebherr LGD 1800, and this is a limited edition model with 220 made in the colours of the German company Riga Mainz. The packaging is very high quality, there's no tapes to cut, and that's because the trays are clipped together by plastic formers. Inside the lid is a manual, and we'll see more of that soon. And then we've got 3 trays of parts. So as you can see, there are many pieces to this model, and they are all very nicely wrapped. Here's the carrier out of the box with delicate parts properly protected. The manual is quite a large booklet, and it begins with a reprint of technical information from the original Liebherr marketing information. As such, it's comprehensive and it gives you an insight into the real machine. And then there are various load charts for the configurations that the real crane could have. And this was a heavyweight machine with combined boom and jib lengths of up to 160 metres. The second half of the manual deals with the model, and it describes the main features of assembly. These include annotated photographs, and also diagrams of some of the largest configurations, and that includes reeving diagrams too. One thing that is missing though is a parts list, and it would have been helpful to know which parts are where in the various trays. But on the plus side, the many small bolts and pins are in labelled bags. One thing that becomes apparent is that the big box contains enough parts to build many different configurations of crane. So we can already see that this is going to be a very flexible model. This is a special model for collectors, and it comes with a collector's plate. It has a unique serial number in the production run. And the other side is really nice because it's a reproduction of the Liebherr plate for the real crane. As usual for a mobile crane, we'll get it ready for the road. And the first thing to do is to fit some additional headlights. The crane cab has got a neat feature which is 2 sets of windscreens. One for travelling and an open one for when it's working. And we'll fit the closed one. It clips in place, but it's a little bit loose fitting, so you have to be careful to get it properly fixed. And at the back there are a couple of light boards, complete with number plate. They just press into position. There's also an optional winch bar that was used for lifting off a spare wheel, although you don't need it because this crane's not carrying a spare wheel. We return to the crane cab, and there are a couple of tiny lights to fit at the back. The manual suggests gluing them into place, which we're not so keen on. So as an alternative, you can put a little bit of plastic putty in the holes, and that helps the lights to stay in. Plastic wheel chocks are provided, and the best place for these seems to be underneath the crane. And once they're in place, there's also a ladder that you can fit, and that gives it all a nice realistic appearance. The model comes with a big reel of rope which you have to cut into lengths, and then load onto the winch drums. The sides of the body are very nice because there are removable panels which have magnets in them to help them stay on, and then you can insert a key to turn the winch drums. It is quite a big job to load on all of the rope. First of all, it needs to be carefully threaded through the winch drums and tied off into a knot, and once it's secure you can then begin winding on the rope. If you like to inflict pain on yourself, you can do this totally by hand. But you do have over 70 metres of rope to wind on all of the drums. So for your own sanity and well-being, it's best to use an electric screwdriver. There's a lot of reeving to do on the model, and we start with the A-frame. And the instructions for this are not included in a manual, and it actually comes as a separate sheet. Like all reeving, it's a painstaking job. And the best thing to do is to set things up right, so we're using some rope to temporarily support the A-frame. And this is a little bit more complicated because there are 2 separate lengths of rope to be reeved. For that reason, we start at the tying off point and we'll put it on the drum last, and then both sides can be wound onto the drum at the same time and keep them the same length. With the A-frame reeved, it's ready for the road, and if you've got other suitable trucks, you can make up a convoy. We start underneath and there's a high level of detail, and that includes nicely modelled transmission, suspension and steering parts. The tyres have got a nice tread pattern. The carrier cab has a realistic number plate and nice chevron graphics, and the finer details such as the windscreen wipers and mirrors are delicately formed, as is the step into the cab. Inside the cab, the console and instruments are realistically modelled, and the wheels look very good too, with both driven and non-driven axles. Another nice touch, which is always good to see, is that there's branding on the tyres. The light stalks are also delicately modelled. The realistic appearance is helped by the ladder and wheel chocks and the tiny graphics. And the big toothed slewing ring is also impressive. The application of the graphics is very high quality considering the shaped surfaces. And there's more high detail at the back of the carrier. Looking at the crane, and the ropes have the colour of new steel, and the rope looks the right size to fit on the crane pulleys. Another point of high detail is the tiny lights on the end of the A-frame, and not only are they there, but they can also be angled. The outrigger beams are of heavy metal construction and there's nice detailing within the casting, and they look really good with the graphics applied. The pads and load spreading beam are all metal, and the pistons are nice and smooth. Detailing behind the carrier cab is really good, and you can see fans underneath the meshed grills, and the exhaust system looks good too. Other areas of high detailing include hydraulic hoses, and these ones have connectors on the end, and there are more hoses running to the outrigger hydraulics. The counterweight blocks are really nice with usable lifting lugs, and they have the Liebherr name and the load rating embossed. Securing chains for the stacks are also modelled. The boom sections are excellent and they have internal bracing also, and the mesh walkways look very realistic. Other really nice details include lifting shackles on the Luffing bridle, and the Luffing bridle also has a rotating and usable hook. The pendants are nicely modelled in metal, and the small plastic bolts also look realistic. The Luffing frames are also heavily modelled, and like everywhere else on the model, all of the sheaves are metal. They are free rolling, but there are so many runs of rope here that it needs some manual intervention when you raise or lower the jib. Other nice details include the wire guy ropes and shackles. Also nice to see on a big crane model is the aircraft warning light and anemometer, which actually rotates. On the heavy jib head, all of the sheaves and rollers turn smoothly. In addition to a smaller block, there's a big double block, and they are both nicely made metal parts. We start underneath and there is linked steering on the front 4 axles, although the linkage is not particularly tight, so you do have to manually adjust each axle. And at the back, the rear 2 axles are also linked. Out on the Cranes Etc. test track, we'll try driving the big Liebherr along, and it does reasonably well with no axle wobble, although not all of the tyres were fully grounded. Let's have a go at adjusting the steering and see what happens. And we'll move the front 4 and rear 2 axles to a full lock. When that's done, the big old crane does a reasonable job of moving through a curve. Let's look at some aspects of rigging the crane, and here is the derrick mast. And the parts fit together reasonably smoothly with only paint thicknesses causing some tightness. Once the connecting points are more or less in position, the best thing to do is to line them up properly. And here we're using a pointed tool to achieve that. It's worth doing this because for the plastic bolts to fit in easily, it's best if the holes are lined up properly. The only thing to be careful of here is if the bolt's not going in reasonably easily, then don't try and force it with a lot of pressure because it might easily bend. Here we now fast forward and we see the derrick mast all bolted up, and the bolts do a good job of forming a strong and stable connection. A nice aspect of the boom and jib sections is that they telescope properly to reduce the number of shipping loads. So here we are on site, so let's open up the outriggers, and they fold out and telescope smoothly. A particularly nice part of the model engineering is the spreader beam and pads, and that's because they have a magnetised connection, so you can move them around carefully as one unit. Once it's assembled, we can locate it under the outrigger piston, and the piston easily screws down to rest on the beam. The crane cab rotates out from the transport position, And another very nice little feature is the fold down ladder, and we just need to be careful that we don't rotate the crane with the ladder still down. Now we're ready to attach the boom and derrick, and we've pre-assembled those, and they have to be gently eased into place. Again, once they are properly lined up, then they go together well, and large steel pins slide in to make the connection. At the back we can slide in the counterweight tray, and when it's correctly pushed in, you then secure it with a couple of steel pins. After that we can use the giant hand crane to load up the counterweight blocks, and there are securing chains which can be put through the centre hole to bind them together. There's a lot of reeving up to do on the model, and here we're reeving up the luffing gear for the main boom. And while none of the reeving is particularly difficult, as always you have to be careful to do it properly and follow the diagrams. And most of all, try not to punch your own head off if you make a mistake. We need to attend to some details, and the hydraulic hoses from the boom winch have to be connected up to the body. And again, some plastic putty has been used to secure the connections. With the derrick and boom all assembled, we can winch it up with an electric screwdriver. And it's always satisfying to see the crane begin to rise. We are rigging the crane with a main boom and a luffing jib, so we'll fix the luffing jib and pin it in place. And a nice inclusion with the model is a working dolly. The luffing jib pins to it, and the dolly rolls very smoothly. And if you didn't know, the dolly is used to bring the jib closer to the crane, so that makes it easier to lift it. With the jib up, we can fit the warning light and reeve the big hook. And after all that, here is the crane assembled and lifting a large coke drum. In the configuration we've rigged it, it's 2 meters tall, but we haven't even used all of the parts in the box. And if we used all of those, the crane would be around 2.9 meters tall, or about 9.5 feet. Let's look at some of the other features of the model, and this version includes opening carrier cab doors, and again tiny magnets are used to secure the doors in a closed position. Going back to the crane cab, and it tilts fully and can pose in that position. And there's also a sliding cab door, although it's a little bit tricky to operate. But it does let you get a clear view of the detail inside. The counterweight tray has got nice operating pistons, and they can be locked in position. Also what's nice is that the tray rests on working rollers, so if the counterweight tray needs to move sideways, it can. Now that the crane is fully rigged, let's try to rotate it, and it does turn nice and smoothly. And of course you need to be careful what you're doing, and don't leave the crane cab ladder down. But this model is all about flexibility, and here are some of the parts used in other configurations. This is a relatively small jib extension, and to go with it there's also a small hook block. If you want a very long boom, such as for wind turbine lifts, then you need a reducer section, and that part is also included in the box. Also included with that part are the guy wires for the mid-pendant support, and there are also a couple of alternative jib heads. Of course, one thing you can do with a model like this is produce great mini dioramas. This version of the model looks great in Riga Mainz colours, and it has been considerably reworked and enhanced by YCC models. It is a first-class model with highly authentic detailing, and another highlight is that it's so flexible and can be configured in any way. Once again, YCC has produced an excellent crane model.